Today's reading is from Romans 1, verse 18 to chapter 2, verse 1. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of people who suppress the truth by their unrighteousness. Because what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, because they are understood through what has been made. So people are without excuse, for although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or give him thanks, but they became futile in their thoughts, and their senseless hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for an image resembling mortal human beings, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over in the desires of their hearts to impurity, to dishonor their bodies amongst themselves. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creation, rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them over to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged the natural sexual relations for unnatural ones, and likewise the men also abandoned natural relations with women, and were inflamed in their passions for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men, and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them over to a depraved mind, to do what they should not be done. They are filled with every kind of unrighteousness, wickedness, covetousness, malice. They are rife with envy, murder, strife, deceit, hostility. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, contrivers of all sorts of evil, disobedient to parents, senseless, covenant breakers, heartless, ruthless. Although they fully know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but also approve of those who practice them. Therefore you are without excuse, whoever you are, when you judge someone else. For on whatever grounds you judge another, you condemn yourself, because you who judge practice the same things.
Okay. I titled the sermon, yes, that verse. It's actually two verses right in the middle there. I wanted to tackle this because we have an end-of-year survey where everybody who attends MCC can go through and, tell us a little bit about how they're feeling about MCC and what's going well for them and what isn't going well. And one of the questions that we ask is, what sermon topics would be helpful for you to hear? And one of the topics mentioned more than once was, could we look at the clobber passages in the Bible? That is, the 6 or 7 passages, depending on which ones get counted, that mention homosexuality. So I've got them listed there. If you've never heard of the clobber passages, these are the clobber passages. There are 3 in the Old Testament, 4 in the New Testament. And so I thought, look, we got to do it. And in fact, I have done a sermon on one of these before. If we wanted to read the Bible badly, here's what we would do. We would cut all of these references out of their context and paste them into like a bullet list, like I've done there, and insist that this list gives us the answers to what the Bible says about homosexual orientation and homosexual acts. But here at MCC, we try not to read the Bible badly, but to read it well. And that means that each reference can't be cut out of its context. It has to be left where it belongs, as part of a wider discussion in a letter or a law code or whatever the genre, and it has to be read in its cultural and its literary context. Now, we cannot hope to do that with all 7 verses, or I don't know when we would get to go home. So I just wanted to look at the one that creates the most difficulty, and that is Romans 1, 26 and 27. And what I have noticed tonight is that almost every chair is full, and I'm just a bit curious. Is this like coincidental, or the fact that we stuck this in the newsletter last week might have prompted some people to go, oh, actually, I really want to be there tonight. Anyway, I'm kind of interested in that. I don't know, can you give me like I'm here because I saw it in the newsletter? Is that, yeah, okay, cool. Do you know, as pastor of this amazing congregation that I love so much, I sometimes wish that I could just make this passage disappear, because I know that it's been used in ways that have just caused immeasurable harm to some people in this congregation, maybe many people in this congregation. I really wish that I either had a magic wand to make it disappear, or I had some sort of watertight explanation for it, like, oh, well, this is just a translation problem. You see, if we look at the Greek word, it doesn't actually mean what it says it means. And maybe some of you know that's actually the case if you look at one of the clobber passages in 1 Corinthians 6, where there are some very uncertain Greek words that have been translated in some quite dodgy ways some time ago, and now we're kind of stuck with these Bible translations. And I've spoken on that Corinthian passage once before, and if you're interested in what I had to say then, if you want to know, a little bit more about that clobber passage, you'll find that sermon on our YouTube channel. It's in the Corinthians series, and I can't remember what it's called, but I think it might be called something like Sexual Ethics or something. So if you want to go and have a look at that, well, feel free. So as I said, the 1 Corinthians 6 passage, there is some translation issues there. But that's not the case here. No translation issues here. I've got a background in biblical scholarship, and as a biblical scholar, I cannot say with integrity that there is some way of looking at these verses that proves that Paul was absolutely fine with homosexual sex between two consenting adults. I can't do that. What I can say, though, is that these verses are not answering the question that people keep asking of them. Listening to how these two verses have been used to argue against same-sex marriage or relationships, you could be excused for thinking that the purpose of Paul writing these verses was to express his views on homosexuality so that he could mark out his turf in the 21st century culture wars, or maybe let everybody know how he voted in the 2017 plebiscite. But this, of course, is incorrect. Paul had no idea, no clue, that this letter that he was writing to the churches in Rome, somewhere around 56 CE, was going to be used more than 2,000 years later as fodder to exclude some Christ followers from the church. He had no idea that his letter would be used in that way. Well, what was Paul writing about if he wasn't writing about the 2017 plebiscite? What was the question that he was answering when he wrote this first chapter? What is it that he was trying to communicate in this letter? And where do these two contentious verses fit in to his flow of thought? I'm going to use my usual approach of reading behind the text, in front of the text. If you've been around for a while, you'll know what I'm talking about, and if you haven't, you'll pick it up as we go along. And this might take a little longer than usual, but by the end of this, I hope that we might realise that these verses actually have quite a bit of power and positive relevance to LGBTQ Christians. And just by the way, I've been meaning to say this for ages. Every time I stand up here and talk about the Jewish background to some verse or the New Testament, I'm acutely aware of the current situation in Palestine right now. Going behind the text is always going to involve talking about Jews and Judaism, and it's really important to understand that this is now and that was then. But I am aware that sometimes talking about the historical and cultural background of the New Testament brings some very strange ironies as we think about what's currently going on. So, what was happening at the church in Rome? You're going to have to stay with me on this. As with any letter, we can't be 100% sure on what was happening in Rome that Paul was responding to. Why was he writing this letter? Well, we're not 100% sure, but we do know some very interesting things. Around 50 CE, 50 AD, the Emperor Claudius threw out all of the Jewish people living in Rome. He did that because there was some internal conflict going on among the Jewish people over someone called Chrestus. We know this because a Roman historian called Suetonius wrote about it. And we've got those writings today. Scholars are pretty sure that this Chrestus was a reference to Christ. It's very close in the Greek. And that the conflict was between those Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah and sent by God, and those Jews who thought that that idea is just nonsense. Claudius, he didn't really care. He doesn't care about the finer points of Jewish theology, of Jewish religious disputes, and so he just threw all of the Jewish people out to get rid of the disruptive conflict that was going on. So that was around 50 CE. Several years later, a lot of Jews returned to Rome after all the fuss had died down. There were Christians among those Jews, Jewish Christians from a Jewish heritage, and they came back to a church that was now full of non-Jewish Christians, non-Jewish believers, or the term gets used in the New Testament, Gentile believers. So, Christians who didn't have a Jewish heritage, who were very happy to put bacon in their casseroles, and who didn't circumcise their baby boys. Now, these Gentile Christians, they had been following the Jewish Jesus and worshipping the Jewish God, but without all of the Jewish rituals and customs because, well, they weren't Jewish. And they were finding their own way of following Jesus, and the church was becoming more and more divorced from its Jewish culture and worldview. Are you with me so far? If you're not, you can get out Candy Crush and, ask me later. But I'm wondering if you can imagine the tensions that might have arose when the Jewish Christians returned to Rome, expecting to just walk back into their former church and just pick up where they left off. Instead, they discover that their church has moved on. It's moved on from its Jewish roots, and it's now worshipping in ways that made complete sense to non-Jewish believers, but caused a lot of turmoil and anguish for Jewish believers. Imagine that we all left MCC Brisbane for 6 years. And when we returned, we discovered that the congregation was now mostly LGBTQ people from the Greek Orthodox Church. And now the church service went on for 3 hours, which I promise this one won't go, even if, it's a little long. And now we're expected to stand for most of the service. And everybody kisses paintings of saints that are around the walls. We don't really understand what that's about. Might that cause a few tensions if we all came back and discovered that that's how church is done now? Could we do church together with that congregation that's here now? Could we be a church together? Could we accept the way that this church now worships, accept that that's just as valid as the way we used to do it 6 years ago? Do you know, in at least some Greek Orthodox churches, sitting with your legs crossed is not permitted. Ryan? Shane? I don't know. Can you please? Because it shows a lack of attention and it shows a lack of respect towards God. So crossing your legs is not permitted. You all good with that? Can we do that every week? So I think maybe that illustration just gives us a little bit of insight into what it might have been like for these Jewish Christians to come back and discover their church has moved on and things are no longer being done the way they always were. It's clear from Paul's letter to the Roman church that there are a lot of tensions in this church between these two different groups. They each have deeply held customs and worldviews and beliefs about how people should worship God. In fact, probably the Jewish Christians thought that the non-Jewish Christians needed to convert to Judaism before they could really be followers of the Jewish Jesus. It kind of makes sense, doesn't it? He is Jewish, so you have to be Jewish if you want to worship the Jewish Jesus. The non-Jewish Christians, they disagreed, and strongly. There was no way they were giving up their bacon. And they were certainly not getting circumcised. Thank you very much. So at least one of the purposes that Paul had in writing this letter to the church in Rome was to bring some unity to these two factions. And he did that by pointing out that Jesus was now the basis of their unity. Not their ethnic heritage, not their religious heritage. Their ethnic and religious heritage were no longer the defining factor of who was in and who was out of the people of God. And it was probably a particularly hard thing for Jewish believers to swallow. But Paul insisted that even though their Jewish ethnicity and their religion had previously defined them as God's people, since Jesus came, everything had changed. The boundaries of God's people were suddenly a whole lot wider. And Paul wanted the Jewish believers to know that while Sabbath keeping or circumcision or food laws might still be important to them, they couldn't use those things to negatively judge those who didn't hold to those rituals. It was faith in Jesus that mattered now. It was allegiance to Jesus that mattered. And both of these groups had faith in Jesus. Faith in Jesus should be able to break the wall down between the two groups. How are we going? This is a lot to take in. All right, that's behind the text. What's happening in this text? What's happening in the passage that we've been reading? Here's how Paul does this. Here's how he's going to try and bring some unity between these two groups and break down the wall between them. He could just explain it in plain language, as I've just kind of done now. But, you know, plain language doesn't work as much as setting a word trap, setting an ideas trap, a clever rhetorical trap. This is what Paul is doing for his readers. Now, it's the finer details of this first century rhetorical trap that's caused so many problems for gays and lesbians in the 21st century. And you need to know that homosexual sex, particularly between males, was not that uncommon in the non-Jewish, in the Gentile culture, in the Gentile world of the first century, especially between men and boys or between men and slaves, basically men of higher status engaging in sex with men or boys of a lower status. Not terribly uncommon in the Gentile world. In the Greek culture, especially, it was not considered particularly immoral or unusual. In fact, the Greek gods themselves engaged in homoerotic activities every now and again. Raymond Collins, who wrote a book called Sexual Ethics and the New Testament, he says, it was considered to be a component of cultured education for a grown man to have homoerotic activities with the youth. He also mentions another writing about women on the island of Lesbos engaging in sexual activity with other women. That was much less common. Nobody really cared what women did. A few Roman writers, so we've got Greek culture and we've got Roman culture, and they're all mixed in together around this time. A few Roman writers, they raised concerns about the wisdom of engaging in too much homosexual sex, because being driven by lust is considered to be something very unwise in a culture that values moderation. But by and large, homosexual sex was not a shocking or a terribly immoral practice in this Greco-Roman Gentile society. So that's the society that this church has found itself. Jewish writers, on the other hand, they were utterly opposed to any same-sex sexual activity. They considered it an immoral practice of the Gentiles that had come from their pagan background, and something that really distinguished Jewish culture from Gentile culture. It was one of the dividing lines. Philo, he was a Jewish writer, a contemporary of Paul, and he sees men having sex with men is driven by unrestrained lust that will eventually make one sterile. That's what he believed. So, what we have to do is keep these two different cultures in mind as we look at the trap that Paul is about to set for the readers of his letter to the Roman church. He starts, I don't know if it seems like Sophie read that thing a long time ago and we've covered a lot of ground since then, but if you have a look back at Romans 1 sometime, you'll notice all these references back to Genesis 1. So Paul starts by pointing back to Genesis 1 and denouncing the pagan Gentiles for not recognising the God who created the world. How foolish they are, he says, not to recognise and worship the God of creation. There's Genesis language all over the place. He says instead they worship the birds or the animals or images of people that God created, instead of worshipping the Creator God. And you can imagine, as this letter is read out in church and these two groups are sitting there listening, Paul's Jewish readers, they're nodding like, yes, that's exactly right, those ungodly and those foolish Gentiles. They upended the whole point of creation by worshipping the creation instead of worshipping the Creator. Paul's setting this up. He lures his Jewish readers a little further by going to the stereotype of the lustful Gentile. God just gave up on these foolish pagans, just threw his hands in the air and let the females have sex with the females and the males have sex with the males, knowing that there was no way that this could possibly result in being fruitful and multiplying. Genesis 1. Again, you can see the Jewish readers, they're just shaking their heads at the foolishness of this crazy behaviour. It says no hope for these pagan Gentiles. No wonder God gave up on them and chose us to be his people instead. And then Paul goes on to list every negative stereotype of the first century non-Jewish pagans that he can think of. And he outlines the dire position that non-Jews were in before Jesus came along. He says they're filled with wickedness, covetousness, malice. They're rife with envy, murder, strife, deceit, hostility. He's laying it on. They're gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, contrivers of all sorts of evil, disobedient to parents, senseless, covenant breakers, heartless, ruthless. Again, can you imagine what the Jewish group is sitting there? Man, yeah, they're terrible. If it wasn't for Jesus, what would they do? They're just such a wicked bunch. They're not like us. They're not like us. Who've had God's word all along. And then suddenly, Paul pounces. He suddenly turns on his Jewish readers in chapter 2, verse 1, the very last verse that Sophie read. And the content of that verse is basically, and you're no better, because you have the audacity to judge them. You fail to see your own sin, but you're so eager to judge others. You think that you can get away with that because you're Jewish? Paul says there will be affliction and distress on everyone who does evil, on the Jew first. To pull out verses 26 and 27 and use them to argue against LGBTQ inclusion into church, in the church, is to just miss the whole point of the passage. How foolish it is for one group of Christians to judge another group. Both are equally accountable to God, and both are equally accepted by God through the faithfulness of Jesus. I tried hard to think of an equivalent analogy, and I started to imagine that Paul wasn't talking to two groups that are divided along ethnic, racial lines, but to two different generational groups. And I wondered if it was generational groups rather than these two racial groups, I wonder whether his argument might have gone something like this. Those young people, those Gen Zers, man, they complain about the cost of housing, but they're out ordering Uber Eats. And they're going on overseas holidays. You can't get them to volunteer. They've got no sense of civic duty at all. They only care about themselves. And don't get me started on their work ethic. Oh my gosh, they wouldn't know hard work if it came and bit them on the bum. Paul says that. And then he turns to the boomers. Because the boomers have been nodding, yeah, along with him, agreeing with every word. And then he says, okay, boomers, you think you're better than them. You judge them and you ignore your own failings. When you judge and condemn them, you judge and condemn yourself. You're the generation who created this society, and they're the ones who have to live in it. How are we feeling now? Boomers? Gen Z? You see, Paul's point is not to declare the sinfulness of ordering Uber Eats. It's to catch the boomers in their arrogance of judging the Gen Zers. The Gen Zs and the boomers all have sinned and have fallen short of the glory of God. So, I'm wondering if you're starting to see the implications of this text for us today in relation to LGBTQ Christians and those who judge them as somehow being less. Paul says, if you're going to be a church together, you've got to accept one another. There's no room for one group of Christ followers to judge or exclude another group of Christ followers. God has accepted both groups, and so you had better do the same. If you can't bring yourself to eat bacon, fine, no one's forcing you to. But do not judge the one who does. Because if God has accepted them, you have no business doing otherwise. In fact, you are walking down a dangerous path when you exclude someone that God has accepted. So far from using this passage to condemn same-sex relationships, it's a passage that should be used to argue against the arrogance of thinking that one group of Christians can exclude another group of Christians that God has fully accepted. And so, you are the people of God, and nothing and no one can separate you from the love of God. Paul says that a little later. There's also a bunch of resources on our website. It's under the resource section, drop-down menu, and there's a whole bunch of really good resources that pick up those clobber passages and look at them with some really good background, and they're all very affirming resources. So if you really want to get into clobber passages and try and understand them better, you know, as I said, don't do a cut and paste, but those resources are there, and some of them are really, really good. Cool.